In the shadowed halls of Greystone Manor, a scream pierces the night, and a trusted butler lies dead, a bronze statuette stained with his blood. Who struck the fatal blow in this elegant prison of secrets? Was it the dashing captain, hiding a wartime past, the glamorous widow with a missing glove? Or the quiet spinster clutching a mysterious note, as suspicion tightens its grip? Only Miss Jane Marple, with her unassuming brilliance and razor-sharp mind, can unravel the web of lies. In a world where every glance hides a motive and every clue masks a trap, one question burns. What secret was worth killing for? Dive into a classic mystery where nothing is as it seems, and the truth waits in the shadows. Chapter 1. The setup in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the hedgerows bloomed with the last of summer's roses, and the air carried the faint tang of autumn. A sense of unease had settled over the grand estate of Ashburn Hall. The sprawling Georgian manor, with its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys, stood as a monument to old wealth and older secrets. Its current occupant, Sir Reginald Ashburn, a widower of 60 with a penchant for rare books and an iron grip on his family's legacy, had invited a select group of guests for a weekend retreat. The occasion was ostensibly to celebrate the acquisition of a rare manuscript, a medieval illuminated text said to be worth a small fortune. Yet, beneath the polished surface of polite invitations and clinking glasses, there simmered a tension that even the most casual observer could not ignore. The guests arrived on a crisp Friday evening, their motor cars crunching along the gravel drive as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. First came Lady Beatrice Ashburn, Sir Reginald's younger sister, a woman of 45 whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes missed little. She wore her widowhood like a badge, her black silk gown rustling as she descended from her car, her face set in a mask of practiced civility. With her was her son, Charles Ashburn, a lanky young man of 22, whose easy charm and quick smile belied a certain restlessness in his gaze. Charles, it was whispered, had debts in London that his modest inheritance could not hope to cover. Next arrived Dr. Evelyn Harcourt, a physician of some renown, whose cool demeanor and precise movements suggested a mind as disciplined as it was brilliant. She had been Sir Reginald's personal doctor for a decade, a position that granted her unusual access to the family's private affairs. Her companion, Miss Clara Wentworth, was a contrast in every way. A nervous, bird-like woman of 30, Sir Reginald's private secretary, whose devotion to her employer bordered on the fanatical. Her hands fluttered as she carried a leather satchel filled with papers, her eyes darting to the windows of the hall as if expecting some unseen threat. The final guests were an odd pair. Mr. Lionel Grayson, a book dealer from London with a reputation for ruthless ambition, and his wife, Mrs. Margot Grayson, a former actress whose beauty still turned heads, though her laughter carried a brittle edge. Lionel had brokered the deal for the manuscript, and his presence was both necessary and, to some, unwelcome. Margot, clinging to his arm, seemed more interested in the champagne than the manuscript, her eyes scanning the room for admiration. The household staff, too, played their parts in the evening's quiet drama. Mrs. Agnes Poole, The housekeeper moved with the silent efficiency of one who had served the Ashburns for 30 years. Her stern face betrayed nothing, but her eyes lingered on each guest as she directed the maids to serve drinks. The butler, Mr. Thomas Reed, a man of 50 with a soldier's bearing, ensured the silver gleamed and the fire roared, though his stiff posture hinted at a discomfort beyond the demands of his role. A young footman, James Carter, barely 20, hovered at the edges, his eagerness to please marred by a tendency to eavesdrop. Dinner was served at precisely 8 o'clock in the grand dining room, where candlelight flickered on the polished mahogany table and the crystal chandelier cast delicate prisms across the walls. Sir Reginald presided at the head, his silver hair catching the light. His voice measured as he spoke of the manuscript's history, a tale of monks, wars, and hidden vaults that held the table in rapt attention. Yet, as the courses progressed, from consomme to roast pheasant, the conversation grew strained. Lady Beatrice made a pointed remark about Charles's London habits, earning a flush from her son and a tight smile from Sir Reginald. Dr. Harcourt deflected a question about her recent travels, with a cool precision that left Miss Wentworth fidgeting. Mr. Grayson's attempt to discuss the manuscript's valuation was met with a curt dismissal from Sir Reginald, who seemed unusually protective of his prize. By 10 o'clock, as the guests retired to the drawing-room for coffee and brandy, the atmosphere had thickened. Miss Wentworth excused herself early, claiming a headache. Though her hurried steps suggested otherwise, Charles slipped out to the terrace, a cigarette glowing in the dark. Lady Beatrice and Mrs. Grayson exchanged barbed pleasantries about fashion, while Mr. Grayson and Sir Reginald retreated to a corner, their voices low but intense. Dr. Harcourt sat by the fire, her eyes fixed on a book she did not read, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm. It was then that Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming figure in a lavender shawl, entered the scene. She had not been among the invited guests, but had arrived at the behest of her old friend, the vicar of St. Mary Mead, who had heard whispers of discord at Ashburn Hall. Miss Marple's presence was almost unnoticed, her small frame and gentle demeanor blending into the background. Yet her eyes, bright and sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. She accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Poole with a murmured thank you, her gaze sweeping the room as she settled into an armchair. By the window. To an outsider, the evening might have seemed merely a gathering of the well-to-do, a display of wealth and refinement. But to Miss Marple, whose understanding of human nature was as keen as any detective's, the signs were unmistakable. The forced laughter, the glances that lingered too long, the silences that spoke louder than words, all pointed to a storm brewing beneath the surface. She sipped her tea, her mind already cataloguing the details, the way Miss Wentworth's hands trembled as she left, the faint smudge of ink on Mr. Grayson's cuff, the curious absence of Sir Reginald's usual signet ring. As the clock struck 11, the guests began to disperse to their rooms, their footsteps echoing in the vast halls. Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, her thoughts turning over the evening's observations. She had no reason to suspect a crime yet, but experience had taught her that where there was such tension, such hidden motives, Trouble was rarely far behind Dot, and so, as the fire burned low and the wind whispered through the ancient oaks outside, the stage was set for a tragedy that would soon demand the full attention of Miss Marple's remarkable mind. Chapter 2. The shadow-falsed dining room of Greystone Manor gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, its crystal prisms scattering light across the polished mahogany table. The clink of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation filled the air, but beneath the veneer of civility, a current of unease rippled through the guests. It was the evening of August 8th, 1925, and the engagement dinner for Clara Ashford and Captain Lionel Travers was in full swing. Yet, as the clock on the mantel struck 9, a sudden scream shattered the decorum, heralding a crime that would stain the manor's history. The scream came from the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with exotic plants and wicker furniture, where Clara had slipped away to fetch her shawl. The guests froze, forks poised mid-air, as Lady Beatrice rose from her seat, her face a mask of controlled alarm. "What in heaven's name was that?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence. Captain Travers was the first to move, his military instincts propelling him toward the conservatory, with Gerald Ashford and Dr. Langley close behind. The others followed, a procession of anxious faces, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. In the conservatory, they found Clara kneeling beside a crumpled figure, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. It was Mr. Grayson, the butler, lying motionless on the tiled floor, his face ashen and his eyes wide with a final, unseeing stare. A thin trickle of blood seeped from a wound at his temple, pooling beneath a heavy bronze statuette of a nymph that lay discarded nearby. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "He was just lying here. I found him like this." Dr. Langley, ever the professional, knelt to examine the body, his fingers probing for a pulse. "He's dead," he announced, his voice steady but his hands betraying a slight tremor as he adjusted his spectacles. "The wound suggests a blow to the head, likely with that statuette. It's recent, within the last half hour, I'd wager." The guests exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock, suspicion, and barely concealed fear. Lady Beatrice took charge, her authority unshaken despite the horror. "No one is to touch anything," she ordered. "We must summon the police at once." She turned to Gerald, who stood pale but composed. "Gerald, fetch the telephone in the study. And you, Captain Travers, ensure no one leaves this room." Her tone brooked no argument, and the men obeyed, though Travers's eyes lingered on Clara, who was now being comforted by Mrs. Hartley Dot as the guests milled about, whispering theories and casting sidelong glances. The conservatory became a stage for unspoken tensions. Miss Violet Pennington, the quiet spinster who had arrived as Lady Beatrice's distant cousin, clutched her reticule tightly, her lips moving as if in silent prayer. Mr. Harold Baxter, a jovial businessman with a penchant for whiskey, mopped his brow and muttered about cursed houses. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, her glamorous facade intact, murmured soothing words to Clara, but watched the others with a calculating gaze. And young Tommy Wentworth, the teenage son of a family friend, hovered near the door, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. The police, led by the gruff Inspector Hargreaves, arrived within the hour, their heavy boots tracking mud across the manor's pristine floors. Hargreaves, a man of middle age with a bulldog's tenacity and a skeptic's eye, surveyed the scene with a scowl. "Right, then," he said, addressing the assembled guests. "No one leaves Greystone Manor until we've got to the bottom of this. I'll need statements from everyone present, starting with you." Miss Ashford, Clara, still shaken, nodded mutely, her hands twisting the shawl into knots. As the inspector began his interrogations, the guests were shepherded back to the drawing room, where the atmosphere grew thicker with suspicion. Gerald Ashford, ever the barrister, leaned toward Captain Travers and whispered, "This is no random act, Lionel. Grayson was too careful a man to be caught off guard. Someone in this house had a reason to silence him." Travers nodded, his jaw tight, but his eyes strayed to the conservatory door, where the police were now photographing the scene. The clock ticked on, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding. The guests were questioned one by one, their alibis meticulously recorded. Lady Beatrice claimed to have been in the dining room all evening, overseeing the dinner. Captain Travers said he'd stepped out to the terrace for a cigarette at 8:45 p.m., returning just before the scream. Gerald Ashford admitted to visiting the library to retrieve a book at 8:30 p.m., alone. Mrs. Hartley said she'd been in the powder room, refreshing her makeup, while Dr. Langley claimed to have been in the billiard room with Mr. Baxter, though Baxter confessed to stepping out briefly to fetch another drink. Miss Pennington said she'd been in her room, writing letters, and Tommy Wentworth swore he'd been sneaking a biscuit from the kitchen pantry. Each alibi was plausible, yet each left gaps, moments unaccounted for, movements unseen. Inspector Hargreaves scribbled notes, his pencil scratching like an accusation. "Someone here knows more than they're letting on," he growled, his eyes sweeping the room. "And I'll find out who." As the night wore on, the guests retired to their rooms under police supervision, the manor's grandeur now a gilded cage. In the village of St. Mary Mead, however, word of the murder reached a certain unassuming spinster known for her keen observation and quiet wisdom. Miss Jane Marple, knitting by her cottage fireside, listened as her maid, Florence, relayed the gossip from the manor. "They say it's a right scandal, Miss Marple," Florence said, her eyes wide. "Poor Mr. Grayson, struck down in his prime. The police are baffled, they say." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild blue eyes sharpening. "Baffled, are they?" she murmured, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Well, Florence, I dare say a visit to Greystone Manor might be in order. There are patterns in human nature, you see, and no crime is ever quite as mysterious as it seems." By morning, Miss Marple would arrive, her unassuming presence belying the razor-sharp mind that would unravel the secrets of Greystone Manor. For now, the house slept uneasily, its walls whispering of motives and lies, and the bronze statuette, wiped clean of fingerprints, lay silent in the conservatory, guarding the truth of a killer's hand. Chapter 3. The arrival of Miss Marple, morning of August 9th, 1925. dawned grey and heavy over Greystone Manor, the sky bruised with clouds that mirrored the mood within. The once vibrant estate seemed muted, its rose gardens dulled by a fine mist that clung to the air. Inside, the guests moved like spectres, their voices hushed, their eyes darting to every shadow. The murder of Mr. Grayson, the butler, had cast a pall over the house, and Inspector Hargreaves's brusque interrogations had done little to ease the tension. By 10 o'clock, a new figure arrived at the manor's grand entrance, her unassuming presence a stark contrast to the chaos she was about to unravel. Miss Jane Marple stepped from the village taxi, her black umbrella tucked neatly under one arm and a wicker basket dangling from the other. Her neat grey coat and sensible hat gave her the air of a country spinster, but her blue eyes, sharp and inquisitive, missed nothing. She had been invited by Lady Beatrice Ashford herself, who, despite her imperious nature, held a grudging respect for Miss Marple's reputation in St. Mary Mead, a woman of uncommon sense. Lady Beatrice had once remarked, and now, with a murder on her doorstep, she had sent for the one person whose quiet observation might pierce the veil of deceit. As Miss Marple crossed the threshold, she was greeted by Clara Ashford, whose pale face and red-rimmed eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank you for coming," Clara said, her voice trembling. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful. Poor Mr. Grayson, and now we're all under suspicion." Miss Marple patted Clara's hand gently, her expression one of serene compassion. "My dear, do not distress yourself unduly," she said. "The truth has a way of revealing itself, like a stitch that comes loose in a poorly knit sweater." Lady Beatrice descended the grand staircase, her black dress rustling with authority. "Miss Marple," she said, her tone crisp but not unkind, "I trust you'll bring some clarity to this sordid affair. The police are trampling through my home like a herd of elephants, and I won't have it said that Greystone Manor harbors a murderer without resolution." Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile polite but enigmatic. "I shall do my best, Lady Beatrice. Now, perhaps you could show me where this tragedy occurred." The conservatory, still cordoned off by the police, was a scene of ordered chaos. The bronze statuette, now dusted for fingerprints, but yielding none, rested on a table, its nymph's serene face at odds with the violence it had wrought. Inspector Hargreaves, his notebook in hand, eyed Miss Marple with thinly veiled skepticism. "And who might you be, madam?" he asked, his tone gruff. "This is a police matter, not a village tea party." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. "Merely an old friend of Lady Beatrice's, Inspector," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I have a habit of noticing things, you see, and sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can be useful." Hargreaves grunted, unconvinced, but allowed her to examine the scene, his attention drawn to a constable reporting on the lack of forced entry. Miss Marple moved slowly through the conservatory, her steps deliberate, her gaze sweeping over the tiled floor, the potted ferns, and the glass walls streaked with mist. She paused by the statuette, noting its weight and the faint scratch on its base. Barely visible, but telling. A curious choice of weapon, she murmured to herself. so conveniently placed, yet so personal. She glanced at the spot where Mr. Grayson's body had lain, now marked by chalk, and her brow furrowed slightly. The angle of the blow, I think, will be most instructive. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple was introduced to the assembled guests, who regarded her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Captain Lionel Travers, standing protectively near Clara, offered a polite nod, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. Gerald Ashford, the barrister, adjusted his cufflinks and gave a thin smile. As if assessing her worth, Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, her elegance undimmed by the morning's grimness, extended a gloved hand, her eyes coolly appraising. Dr. Rupert Langley fidgeted with his spectacles, muttering a greeting, while Mr. Harold Baxter, nursing a brandy despite the hour, chuckled nervously. "Didn't expect a village lady to play detective," he said. Earning a sharp glance from Lady Beatrice, Miss Violet Pennington, clutching her reticule, offered a timid smile, and young Tommy Wentworth, slouched in a corner, stared at Miss Marple as if she were an unexpected puzzle piece. Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, as she listened to the guests' accounts of the previous evening. Inspector Hargreaves, eager to assert control, recounted the alibis: Captain Travers on the terrace at 8:45 p.m., Gerald in the library at 8:30 p.m., Mrs. Hartley in the powder room, Dr. Langley and Mr. Baxter in the billiard room with Baxter's brief absence, Miss Pennington in her room, and Tommy in the kitchen. Each statement was delivered with varying degrees of confidence, but Miss Marple's keen ears caught the hesitations, the too quick assurances, the subtle contradictions. "And you, Lady Beatrice?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but pointed. "You were in the dining room all evening, I understand." Lady Beatrice nodded, her expression unyielding. "Indeed, I was overseeing the dinner preparations. I had no cause to leave." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing, of course, and yet. "It is curious how a house so full of people can leave a man so alone at the moment of his death." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling like dust. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her mind was far from idle. She noted Captain Travers's restless fingers, tapping a rhythm that betrayed his calm facade. She observed Mrs. Hartley's poised stillness, too perfect to be natural. She saw Gerald's sharp glance toward Dr. Langley, who avoided his gaze, and she noticed Miss Pennington's reticule, clutched so tightly that her knuckles were white. People are like skeins of wool, Miss Marple thought, tangled, but with a pattern if one knows where to look. As the morning progressed, Inspector Hargreaves announced his intention to search the guests' rooms, prompting murmurs of protest. Miss Marple, however, requested a moment to speak with Clara privately. In the quiet of the library, Clara's composure crumbled. "I can't believe this has happened," she whispered, tears welling. "Mr. Grayson was so kind, so loyal. Who would do this?" Miss Marple listened, her expression one of grandmotherly concern, but her questions were precise. "Tell me, my dear, did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Grayson yesterday? A word, a look, perhaps a conversation?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing specific, but he seemed distracted, as if something weighed on him. I thought it was just the strain of the party. Miss Marple nodded, filing the observation away. And your fiancé, Captain Travers? He seems a man of strong character, but perhaps a little watchful. Clara flushed, her hands twisting. Lionel's been under strain. The war, you know. It left its mark, but he's devoted to me. Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, her smile reassuring. Of course, my dear. Now, let us return to the others. There is much to unravel, and I suspect the threads are closer than we think. As they left the library, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a small table by the door, where a single glove lay forgotten, its delicate embroidery catching the light. It was a minor detail, but to Miss Marple, no detail was too small to matter. By noon, the manor buzzed with the police's activity, but Miss Marple moved quietly among the guests, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, yet her mind, sharp as a needle, was already weaving the first strands of a pattern that would lead inexorably to the truth. Chapter 4. The question's deepened clock in the drawing room of Greystone Manor chimed noon. On August 9th, 1925, the somber toll a reminder of the grim events that had unfolded the previous night. The guests, confined to the manor under Inspector Hargreaves's watchful eye, sat in uneasy clusters, their conversations stilted and their glances furtive. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax polish and suspicion, as each person weighed their neighbor's words and silences. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, appeared engrossed in her work, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. She had begun her quiet investigation, and now, with the police bustling about, she set about the delicate task of unraveling the truth through careful observation and pointed questions. Inspector Hargreaves, his notebook worn from constant use, had taken over the library as his temporary headquarters. He summoned the guests one by one, his questions blunt and his manner impatient. Yet Miss Marple, with her unassuming air, moved among them with a different approach, her inquiries gentle, her tone conversational, but her purpose no less incisive. She began with Captain Lionel Travers, who stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid despite the casual tilt of his cigarette. Captain Travers, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking rhythmically, you mentioned you were on the terrace at 9:15 last evening. A pleasant evening for a cigarette, I'm sure, but rather chilly, was it not? Travers met her gaze, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. It was cool. Yes, he replied, his voice measured, but I needed a moment's air. The dining room was stifling. Miss Marple nodded, her smile benign. Quite so. And from the terrace, one has a fine view of the conservatory, does one not? The glass walls, so transparent in the moonlight. Travers's fingers paused on his cigarette, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he recovered. I suppose so, he said, but I wasn't looking at the conservatory. I was thinking. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. Of course, she murmured. We all have much to think about at such times. Tell me, did you notice anyone else about? A servant, perhaps, or another guest? Travers shook his head. A touch too quickly. No one. It was quiet. Miss Marple smiled faintly, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted toward Clara, who sat pale and silent across the room. She made no further comment, allowing him to retreat, but her mind filed away the exchange like a carefully labeled card in a catalogue. Next, she turned her attention to Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, who lounged on a velvet settee, her silk dress a study in elegance. Mrs. Hartley's beauty was undeniable, but her eyes held a guarded sharpness that Miss Marple recognized from her years of observing human nature. Mrs. Hartley, Miss Marple began, her tone as warm as a village tea party. You were in the powder room, I believe, when poor Mr. Grayson met his end. Such a lovely room, Lady Beatrice tells me, with that charming mirror framed in gilt. Mrs. Hartley's lips curved in a practiced smile. It is a fine room, Miss Marple. I was merely freshening up. Dinner parties can be so taxing on one's appearance. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the single glove Mrs. Hartley wore, its mate conspicuously absent. Indeed, she said, and the powder room is just down the hall from the conservatory, is it not? One might hear unusual sounds, perhaps. Through those thin walls, Mrs. Hartley's smile tightened, her fingers brushing the empty wrist of her ungloved hand. I heard nothing out of the ordinary, she said smoothly. Only the usual chatter from the dining room. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene. Of course, it's curious, though, how sounds carry in old houses like this. One never knows what one might overhear. As Mrs. Hartley excused herself to speak with Lady Beatrice, Miss Marple's gaze fell on the glove she'd noticed in the library the previous day, still lying on the side table. Its embroidery matched Mrs. Hartley's remaining glove precisely, and Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire further. She then approached Dr. Rupert Langley, who stood by the window, his spectacles glinting as he stared out at the misty gardens. Dr. Langley, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear. You were in the billiard room with Mr. Baxter. I understand, though he stepped out briefly. A quiet evening for billiards, I imagine. With the house so full of activity, Langley adjusted his spectacles, his fingers nervous. Yes, we played a round or two, he said. Baxter's not much for the game, but it passed the time. Miss Marple's needles paused, and when he stepped out, you remained alone. In that large room, with its view of the conservatory door, Langley's eyes flickered, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. Yes, I stayed. I was chalking my cue, I think. Nothing unusual. Miss Marple smiled, her gaze steady. Chalking a cue is such a deliberate act, is it not? One must focus. Yet one's eyes might wander to a door, perhaps, or a shadow, moving beyond it. Langley swallowed, his response a mumbled agreement before he excused himself. Claiming a need for fresh air. Miss Marple continued her rounds, speaking briefly with Gerald Ashford, whose barrister's poise masked a subtle unease when she mentioned the library's proximity to the conservatory. Miss Violet Pennington, her reticule still clutched tightly, spoke of her letter-writing with a tremor in her voice. her eyes avoiding the statuette now displayed on a police evidence table. Young Tommy Wentworth, when questioned, admitted to sneaking biscuits, but blushed furiously when asked if he'd seen anyone near the conservatory, muttering about shadows before climbing up by mid-afternoon. Inspector Hargreaves emerged from the library, his face red with frustration. "These people are as slippery as eels," he muttered to his constable. "Every alibi checks out on paper, but there's something off. No fingerprints, no witnesses. And that blasted statuette could have been picked up by anyone." He glanced at Miss Marple, who was knitting quietly, and snorted. "And you, madam, have you any theories, or are you just here to knit?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. "Oh, I find knitting most illuminating, Inspector," she said. "It gives one time to think, to notice the little things, the way a person holds their hands, or the absence of a glove, or the nervousness in a voice. People are so very revealing, if one knows how to look." Hargreaves stared, unsure whether to be annoyed or intrigued. But before he could respond, a constable interrupted with news of a discovery. A torn scrap of paper found in Mr. Grayson's pocket, bearing the words 8:30 and "Meet me." The room buzzed with renewed tension as the guests were informed. Lady Beatrice's lips thinned, and she declared the note irrelevant, likely a servant's reminder. But Miss Marple's mind was already turning, piecing together the fragments of the evening. The note, the glove, the alibis that aligned to neatly yet left gaps. These were the threads of a pattern, and she was determined to follow them. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple sat with Clara in the drawing-room, offering quiet comfort. "My dear," she said, "you mentioned Mr. Grayson seemed distracted. Did he ever speak of anyone in the house, perhaps someone he trusted or distrusted?" Clara hesitated, then leaned closer. "Once, a few weeks ago, he mentioned overhearing something, a conversation that troubled him. He wouldn't say more, only that it was not his place to interfere." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her mind alight. "Not his place," she repeated softly. "Yet someone, it seems, made it their place to silence him." The manor settled into an uneasy evening, the guests under strict orders not to leave. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked away, retired to her guest room, but sleep was far from her mind. The note, the glove, the shadows. Tommy had seen these were not random threads, but part of a tapestry, and Miss Marple knew that with patience she would find the knot that held it all together. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The afternoon of August 9th, 1925. Cast a pallid light through the tall windows of Greystone Manor, the grey clouds outside mirroring the growing unease within. The murder of Mr. Grayson hung over the household like a storm waiting to break, and the guests, confined to the manor's elegant but stifling rooms, grew restless under Inspector Hargreaves's relentless scrutiny. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained a calm figure amid the tension, her knitting needles clicking softly as she sat in the drawing-room, her mild eyes scanning the faces around her. She had already begun to sense the shape of the mystery. But now, as the investigation deepened, the first red herrings emerged, designed to mislead and obscure. Inspector Hargreaves, his patience fraying, had turned his attention to young Tommy Wentworth, whose nervous demeanor and vague talk of shadows near the conservatory had caught his suspicion. The boy, barely 16, stood before the inspector in the library. His freckled face flushed as he fidgeted under the weight of accusation. "I swear, sir, I was only in the kitchen for a biscuit," Tommy stammered. "I didn't see anything proper, just a shadow moving near the conservatory door. Around 8:30. I thought it was a servant, honest." Hargreaves pounced on the statement, his voice booming. "A shadow, eh? And why didn't you mention this last night? Sounds to me like you're hiding something, lad. Out with it." Tommy's eyes widened, and he glanced toward the drawing room, where the other guests could be heard murmuring. "I didn't think it mattered," he mumbled. "I was scared, that's all." The inspector's scowl deepened, and he declared Tommy's story suspiciously convenient, marking him as a potential culprit in his notebook. The guests, overhearing the exchange, seized on Tommy's admission. Mr. Harold Baxter, his face ruddy from too much brandy, muttered loudly, "The boy's always sneaking about, probably up to no good." Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief, added, "Young people these days lack discipline. Who knows what he was really doing?" Even Gerald Ashford, usually measured, raised an eyebrow and remarked, "It's always the quiet ones you must watch." The tide of suspicion turned swiftly toward Tommy, and Clara, ever kind-hearted, looked distressed, whispering to Captain Travers that the boy couldn't possibly be guilty. Miss Marple, however, remained silent, her needles moving steadily as she observed the rush to judgment. She had seen such diversions before. Red herrings thrown into the path of an investigation to distract from the truth. Tommy's story, vague though it was, held a kernel of authenticity, and his nervousness seemed more the product of youth than guilt. She made a mental note to speak with him later, away from the inspector's bluster, but for now she turned her attention to the others, whose eagerness to point fingers revealed more than they intended. As the afternoon wore on, Hargreaves's focus on Tommy allowed the other guests to relax slightly, their guarded postures softening as they sensed the spotlight shifting. Miss Marple seized the opportunity to continue her quiet inquiries, beginning with Mr. Harold Baxter, who was nursing a glass of whiskey in the billiard room. "Mr. Baxter," she said, her tone as gentle as a village gossip, "you mentioned stepping out of the billiard room last evening to fetch a drink. The drinks table is in the dining room, is it not? Quite near the conservatory door." Baxter's jovial facade faltered, his hand tightening around his glass. "Well, yes, I suppose so," he said, his voice hearty but strained. "But I was only gone a moment, grabbed a bottle, and went straight back." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with polite curiosity. A moment can be so fleeting, yet so significant, she said. "Did you happen to notice Mr. Grayson, perhaps? Or anyone else near the conservatory as you passed?" Baxter shook his head, a touch too vigorously. No, nothing like that. All quiet, far as I saw." Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene, but she noted the sweat on Baxter's brow and the way his eyes avoided hers. She thanked him and moved on to Miss Violet Pennington, who sat in a corner of the drawing room, her reticule still clutched like a lifeline. "Miss Pennington," Miss Marple said, settling beside her, "you were writing letters in your room. I believe, at the time of the tragedy, such a peaceful occupation, letter writing, though it does require concentration. Did you hear anything? Unusual footsteps, perhaps, or voices?" Miss Pennington's thin hands trembled, and she tucked a stray lock of grey hair behind her ear. I don't recall anything specific," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My room is on the second floor, quite far from the conservatory. I was quite absorbed in my writing." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze gentle but probing. "Of course, though it's curious, isn't it, how sounds travel in old houses? A door closing, a hurried step, they can carry such stories." Miss Pennington's lips quivered, and she murmured something about needing rest before retreating upstairs. The day progressed with Hargreaves's investigation growing louder and less productive. He announced the discovery of a second clue, a monogrammed handkerchief bearing the initials LT, found tucked behind a potted fern in the conservatory. The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the room, and all eyes turned to Captain Lionel Travers. "That's preposterous," Travers exclaimed, his face darkening. "I've never owned a handkerchief with those initials. Someone's trying to frame me." Clara clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear, while Gerald Ashford raised a skeptical eyebrow, murmuring a convenient denial. Hargreaves, emboldened by the find, pressed Travers for an explanation, but the captain maintained his innocence, his voice steady but his hands clenched. Miss Marple, watching from her armchair, noted the handkerchief's pristine condition, its folds too perfect for something carelessly dropped in a struggle. Another red herring, she thought, designed to mislead the clumsy boots of the police. But by whom? And why? The initials pointed too obviously to Travers, yet his agitation seemed genuine, tinged with a fear that went beyond indignation. As evening approached, Miss Marple requested a moment alone with Tommy Wentworth, finding him in the garden, kicking at pebbles with a sullen expression. "Tommy," she said softly, "you mentioned seeing a shadow. Can you tell me more? No one will scold you, my dear." The boy hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "It was tall, like a man, but I couldn't see who. They moved quick from the conservatory toward the hall, just before I heard Miss Clara scream. I didn't want to say, 'cause I thought they'd think it was me." Miss Marple patted his shoulder, her expression kind, but our mind racing. "You've done well to tell me, Tommy. Sometimes the smallest thing's a shadow. A sound can light the way to the truth." She sent him back to the house, her thoughts turning to the handkerchief, the glove, the note in Grayson's pocket. And now this shadow. The pieces were scattered, but they were beginning to form a pattern, one that required a careful hand to weave together. Dinner that evening was a tense affair, with Hargreaves's accusations against Tommy and Travers casting a shadow over the table. Lady Beatrice, her patience worn thin, demanded progress. While the guests exchanged guarded glances, Miss Marple, eating sparingly, listened to the undercurrents of conversation, the clipped tones, the forced laughter, the silences that spoke louder than words. She knew the killer was among them, hiding behind a mask of innocence, and she suspected the red herrings were not merely distractions, but clues to the murderer's intent. As the meal ended, Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting basket in hand. She sat by the window, her needles idle as she gazed at the darkened gardens, the handkerchief, the shadow, the alibis that didn't quite align. These were the threads of a tapestry, and Miss Marple was determined to find the flaw that would unravel it. People are so predictable, she murmured to herself, and yet so very clever when they think they can hide. Chapter 6. A clue in detail. Morning of August 10th, 1925. Broke with a faint sun struggling through the clouds over Greystone Manor, casting dappled light across the estate's manicured lawns. Inside, the atmosphere remained heavy, the guests moving like pieces on a chessboard, each wary of the other's next move. The murder of Mr. Grayson, the butler, had tightened its grip on the household, and Inspector Hargreaves's dogged pursuit of young Tommy Wentworth and Captain Lionel Travers as suspects had only deepened the tension. Miss Jane Marple, however, sat quietly in the drawing room, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. She had observed the red herrings, the handkerchief, Tommy's shadow, and now her keen mind sought the subtle clue that would pierce the veil of deception. Miss Marple's morning began with a stroll through the conservatory, where the police had allowed limited access under supervision. The chalk outline of Mr. Grayson's body had been removed, but the bronze statuette, still on an evidence table, gleamed dully in the morning light. Miss Marple paused beside it, her eyes tracing the faint scratch on its base she had noted earlier. It was a small mark, no wider than a hairpin, but its position near the bottom edge, where the statuette would rest on a surface, struck her as curious. Not the sort of mark one makes in a struggle, she murmured, her fingers brushing the air above the scratch. This was made by something deliberate, something precise. She turned her attention to the conservatory's tiled floor, where a faint scuff mark, overlooked by the police, caught her eye near a potted fern. It was a curved smudge, as if a shoe had pivoted sharply, and it lay just beyond the spot where Grayson's body had fallen. Miss Marple knelt, her movements careful despite her age, and examined the mark closely. A quick turn, she said to herself, as if someone moved to strike or to flee. The mark was too faint to identify a specific shoe, but its presence suggested a moment of haste, a detail that did not align with the alibis of calm and calculated movements. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple requested a moment with Lady Beatrice, who was overseeing the household with her usual iron resolve. Lady Beatrice, Miss Marple began, her tone deferential but firm. I understand Mr. Grayson was a most trusted servant. Did he ever mention anything about the statuette? In the conservatory, its placement, perhaps, or any recent changes? Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing the question's intent. The statuette was a gift from my late husband, she said. Grayson dusted it daily, but he never mentioned moving it. Why do you ask? Miss Marple smiled, her expression guileless. Oh, merely a fancy of mine. Objects in a house have their own stories, do they not? A statuette might be moved for cleaning, or perhaps for another purpose. Lady Beatrice frowned but offered no further comment, her attention drawn to a servant reporting a broken teacup. Miss Marple, however, noted the slight stiffening of her hostess's posture, a hint of unease that suggested more than mere irritation. Her next conversation was with Clara Ashford, who sat in the library, her engagement ring glinting as she twisted it nervously. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice low, "I can't stop thinking about poor Mr. Grayson. He was so kind to me, always checking if I needed anything. Do you think it was because of me?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her question was precise. "My dear, you mentioned Grayson seemed distracted. Did he, perhaps, handle anything in the conservatory differently of late? A plant, a table, or that statuette?" Clara's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, he did say something odd a few days ago. He was polishing the statuette and muttered about it being out of place. I thought he meant it was crooked, but he seemed annoyed, almost." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the scratch on the statuette's base. "Out of place," she repeated softly. "How very curious." As the morning progressed, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Rupert Langley, finding him in the billiard room, where he was absently rolling a cue ball across the table. "Dr. Langley," she said, her voice warm but probing, "you examined Mr. Grayson's body. The blow to the head, was it struck with force or precision, and from what angle, do you think?" Langley adjusted his spectacles, his fingers trembling slightly. "It was a single blow, quite forceful," he said. "The angle suggested it came from above, as if the attacker was standing over him. The statuette's weight would make it lethal with even a moderate swing." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her basket, remained still as she considered this. Above, she mused. So the attacker was likely taller than Grayson, or perhaps standing on something. And the statuette, its base is quite flat. Is it not easy to grip, but heavy to lift? Langley nodded, his unease palpable. "Yes, it's heavy. Anyone could have used it, I suppose." Miss Marple smiled, her gaze steady. "Anyone, indeed. But not everyone would leave a mark or choose such a weapon." Her final inquiry of the morning was with Gerald Ashford, who stood in the hall, his barrister's composure intact but his eyes wary. "Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple said, "you were in the library at 8:30, I believe. A quiet place, but close to the conservatory. Did you hear anything, a sound, perhaps, or the rustle of movement?" Gerald's fingers adjusted his tie, a gesture Miss Marple noted as deliberate. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he said. "I was reading, quite absorbed. The library door was closed." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Of course. Though it's odd, isn't it? How a closed door can muffle some sounds, but not others. A cry, a thud those might carry." Gerald's smile was tight. "I heard no such thing, Miss Marple." She thanked him, but her mind lingered on his precise wording, the careful construction of his denial. By noon, Inspector Hargreaves had grown frustrated with the lack of progress, his suspicions still fixed on Tommy and Travers. He announced plans to search the conservatory again, muttering about missed evidence. Miss Marple however, was drawn back to the scuff mark and the statuette's scratch. She requested permission to examine the conservatory once more, and Hargreaves, exasperated, waved her on. "Knit your way to a solution, if you like," he grumbled. Alone in the conservatory, Miss Marple studied the scene anew. The scuff mark, the statuette's scratch, and Clara's comment about it being out of place formed a constellation of clues. She pictured the moment of the crime, Grayson, distracted, perhaps meeting someone as the note in his pocket suggested. A quick movement, a pivot, a blow from above. The statuette, heavy but precise, left no fingerprints wiped clean, perhaps, or handled with care. And that scratch, made not in the act of killing, but before, when the statuette was moved, perhaps, to stage the scene. As she returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, her face pale, was clutching a letter she claimed to have found in her room, addressed to Grayson. It read, "Meet me at 8:30. We must speak." The handwriting was neat but unsigned, and Mrs. Hartley's voice trembled as she handed it to Hargreaves. "I don't know how it got there," she said. "I swear it wasn't mine." The inspector's eyes lit up, seeing another clue pointing to Travers, whose initials matched the handkerchief. Miss Marple, however, saw another thread in the tapestry. The letter, like the handkerchief, was too convenient, too perfectly placed. But the scuff mark and the statuette's scratch, these were not planted clues, but accidents. Moments of truth the killer could not erase. "The smallest details," she murmured, "are often the loudest," as the guests whispered and Hargreaves barked orders. Miss Marple's mind wove the clues together, sensing the pattern was closer to revealing its maker. Chapter 7. More lies surfaced. Afternoon of August 10th, 1925. Settled over Greystone Manor like a heavy fog. The air thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of secrets. The murder of Mr. Grayson, the butler, had woven a web of suspicion that entangled every guest, and Inspector Hargreaves's fixation on Captain Lionel Travers and young Tommy Wentworth had only deepened the chaos. Miss Jane Marple, however, sat quietly in the drawing room, her knitting needles moving with a deceptive calm as her sharp mind pieced together the threads of the mystery. The scuff mark, the scratched statuette, and the too convenient clues of the handkerchief and letter had begun to form a pattern, and now, as tensions rose, the first cracks in the guests' facades revealed hidden motives and buried lies. The discovery of the unsigned letter in Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's room had sent ripples through the household. Inspector Hargreaves, clutching the note with its cryptic "Meet me at 8:30, interrogated Mrs. Hartley with renewed vigor. "You claim this was planted in your room, madam," he said, his voice heavy with skepticism. "Yet it's in your possession, and it points to a meeting with the victim. Care to explain?" Mrs. Hartley, her elegant composure fraying, protested her innocence, her gloved hand fluttering to her throat. "I've told you, Inspector, I know nothing of it. Someone must have placed it there to cast suspicion on me." The other guests, gathered in the drawing room, exchanged glances, their whispers a low hum of speculation. Captain Travers, standing protectively near Clara, clenched his jaw, his eyes darting to Mrs. Hartley with a mix of anger and unease. Gerald Ashford, leaning against the mantel, adjusted his cufflinks and murmured, "Curious how these clues keep appearing, isn't it?" Dr. Rupert Langley, polishing his spectacles, avoided eye contact, while Mr. Harold Baxter, his face flushed from whiskey, chuckled nervously. "Sounds like someone's playing a game with us all," he said, earning a sharp glance from Lady Beatrice. Miss Marple, seated by the window, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity. The letter, like the handkerchief with Travers's initials, was a deliberate misdirection, but its presence in Mrs. Hartley's room suggested a deeper motive. She recalled the single glove in the library, its embroidery matching Mrs. Hartley's remaining one, and wondered if the widow's agitation stemmed from more than just the letter. People hide what they fear to reveal, Miss Marple thought, her needles pausing as she considered the tangled motives at play. Her attention was drawn to a heated exchange in the corner, where Gerald Ashford and Dr. Langley stood in hushed conversation. Gerald's voice, though low, carried a sharp edge. "You were in the billiard room, Rupert, but you didn't see Baxter leave. Come now, you're not that unobservant." Langley's face reddened, his fingers fumbling with his spectacles. "I told you, I was focused on the game. I can't be expected to watch everyone." Their words were cut short as they noticed Miss Marple's gaze, and both men fell silent, their expressions guarded, sensing an opportunity. Miss Marple approached Gerald, her tone as gentle as a village confidant. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "you seem troubled by Dr. Langley's recollection. The billiard room is such a lively place, yet so close to the conservatory. Did you, perhaps, overhear anything from the library that might shed light on the evening's events?" Gerald's eyes flickered, his barrister's poise momentarily shaken. "I've told you, Miss Marple, the library was quiet. I was reading, nothing more." But his fingers lingered on his tie, a nervous gesture Miss Marple noted with interest. She then turned to Dr. Langley, who was retreating toward the window. "Dr. Langley," she said, her voice soft but insistent, "you mentioned the blow to Mr. Grayson's head was struck from above. Could it have been delivered by someone standing on, say, a step or a stool? The conservatory has that little gardening ladder, I believe." Langley's hand froze on his spectacles, his voice faltering. "A ladder, I suppose it's possible, but I didn't notice one. The blow was forceful. That's all I can say." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes keen, of course, "but it's the small things, isn't it, that often tell the largest stories?" As the afternoon wore on, a new revelation surfaced, sparked by a careless remark from Mr. Baxter. Over lunch, his tongue loosened by whiskey, he let slip a comment about Grayson's meddling ways. "Always poking about. That butler," Baxter muttered, swirling his glass. "Heard him arguing with someone a week ago, out by the stables. Couldn't catch the words, but he sounded right put out." The room fell silent, and Hargreaves pounced. "Arguing, you say? With whom? And why didn't you mention this before?" Baxter, realizing his mistake, stammered. "I didn't think it mattered. It was just servant talk. Probably nothing." But the damage was done. The guests' eyes turned to one another, suspicion flaring anew. Clara, pale and trembling, whispered to Miss Marple, "Could it have been about me?" Grayson was so protective. Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. An argument, a distracted butler, a note arranging a meeting. These were not isolated incidents, but threads in a web of deceit. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple sought out Miss Violet Pennington, whose quiet demeanor had begun to intrigue her. She found the spinster in the conservatory, staring at the spot where Grayson's body had lain. "Miss Pennington," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, "you seem deeply affected by this tragedy. Did you know Mr. Grayson well?" Violet's hands tightened on her reticule, her voice barely audible. "He was kind to me, always polite. But I saw nothing that night, Miss Marple. I was in my room." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the reticule, its worn fabric hiding something, she was sure. "Of course," she said, "but sometimes, my dear, we see things we don't realize are important. A glance, a word, perhaps something Mr. Grayson said to you." Violet's lips quivered, and for a moment it seemed she might speak, but she shook her head and hurried away, her reticule clutched like a shield dot by evening. Another lie surfaced, this time from Captain Travers. Under pressure from Hargreaves, he admitted to a brief encounter with Grayson earlier on the evening of the murder. It was nothing, Travers insisted, his voice tight. "He asked me about my time in the war, said he'd heard rumors. I told him to mind his own business." The admission, though minor, fueled Hargreaves's suspicions, and he pressed Travers further, demanding details of the rumors. Travers's face darkened, but he refused to elaborate, his eyes flickering toward Clara, who looked stricken. Miss Marple, listening quietly, noted the timing of Travers's encounter around 8:15 p.m., just before the alibis began to blur. She also recalled Baxter's mention of an argument by the stables, and Clara's comment about Grayson's protectiveness. A picture was forming, not of a random crime, but of a deliberate act, driven by a motive Grayson had stumbled upon. The lies, Travers's omission, Baxter's belated revelation. Violet's reticence were not merely defensive, but protective, shielding a truth that lay just out of reach. As the guests retired for the night, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting idle. The scuff mark, the scratched statuette, the glove, the note. And now these hidden conversations, they were pieces of a puzzle, each revealing a facet of the killer's intent. "Someone feared what Grayson knew," she murmured, her eyes on the darkened gardens, "and that fear drove them to act. Tomorrow," she resolved, she would tighten the threads, drawing out the truth that lay tangled in the lies. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. Evening of August 10th, 1925. Draped Greystone Manor in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling under the weight of its secrets. The murder of Mr. Grayson, the butler, had stretched the nerves of the guests to breaking, and the mounting suspicions fueled by Inspector Hargreaves's relentless interrogations. And Miss Jane Marple's quiet probing had created an atmosphere thick with dread. The lies and half-truths that surfaced earlier in the day had tightened the web of deceit, and now As the guests gathered in the drawing room after a tense dinner, a moment of raw emotion threatened to unravel a critical thread of the mystery. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the intensity of her observations. Her mild blue eyes scanned the room, noting the strained postures and guarded glances of the guests. Captain Lionel Travers stood by the fireplace, his face taut as he avoided Clara Ashford's anxious gaze. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, her elegance strained, toyed with her single glove, her eyes darting to the door. Gerald Ashford, the barrister, sipped his brandy with a calculated calm, while Dr. Rupert Langley adjusted his spectacles with trembling fingers. Mr. Harold Baxter, his face flushed from drink, muttered to himself, and Miss Violet Pennington clutched her reticule, her lips pressed tight. Young Tommy Wentworth, relegated to a corner, looked as if he might bolt at any moment. Inspector Hargreaves, pacing the room like a caged animal, had grown increasingly frustrated with the lack of concrete evidence. The handkerchief with Travers's initials, the unsigned letter found in Mrs. Hartley's room, and Tommy's vague talk of a shadow had led nowhere definitive, and his patience was wearing thin. "Someone in this room knows the truth," he growled, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "And I'll not rest until it's out. You, Captain Travers, your story about Grayson questioning you doesn't add up. What were these rumors?" He mentioned. Travers's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "I've told you, Inspector. It was nothing, a passing comment. He was out of line, and I put him in his place." Clara, seated nearby, reached for his arm, her voice trembling. "Lionel, please, tell them everything. You've nothing to hide." Her plea hung in the air, and for a moment, Travers's resolve seemed to waver. His eyes met hers, and a flicker of something, guilt, fear, or perhaps regret, crossed his face. Before he could respond, a sudden sob broke the tension. Miss Violet Pennington, her reticule slipping to the floor, buried her face in her hands, her thin frame shaking. "I can't bear it any longer," she cried, her voice muffled but piercing. The room froze, every eye turning to the normally reserved spinster. Lady Beatrice, standing by the mantel, frowned, her authority momentarily shaken. "Violet, compose yourself," she said sharply. "What is this nonsense?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her gaze fixed on Violet with gentle but unwavering. "Focus, my dear," she said softly, rising and approaching the trembling woman. "You have carried a heavy burden, I think. Will you share it with us? Sometimes speaking the truth is the only way to find peace." Her voice, warm and steady, seemed to anger Violet, who looked up with tear-streaked eyes. I saw something," Violet whispered, her voice barely audible. "That night, in the hall near the conservatory. I wasn't in my room the whole time. As I said, I'd come downstairs to fetch a glass of water. Around 8:30, I saw Mr. Grayson, and he was speaking to someone in whispers. I couldn't hear the words, but he looked frightened." She paused, her hands twisting together. "Then I heard a sound, like something heavy being moved, and I hurried back upstairs. I was afraid to say anything, because because I didn't want to be involved. The room erupted in murmurs, and Hargreaves pounced, his notebook open. Who was he speaking to? Miss Pennington? Out with it. Violet shook her head, her tears falling freely. I couldn't see. It was too dark, and I was too far away. But it was a man's voice. I'm sure of it. Her confession, though incomplete, sent a shockwave through the guests. Travers's face paled, and Gerald's eyes narrowed, while Dr. Langley's spectacles slipped down his nose. Mrs. Hartley's gloved hand tightened, and Baxter downed his whiskey in one gulp. Miss Marple, her expression serene, knelt to retrieve Violet's reticule, noting a small, folded piece of paper that had slipped out. She handed it back without comment, but her mind catalogued the detail. Thank you, Miss Pennington, she said. You have been very brave. Sometimes, even a partial truth can light the way. Violet nodded, her sobs subsiding, but her eyes remained haunted. Hargreaves, seizing on the new information, turned to the men in the room. A man's voice, she says. That narrows it down, Travers, Ashford, Langley, Baxter, or perhaps even you, young Wentworth. One of you was with Grayson before he died. Who's going to confess? His accusation hung heavy, but no one spoke. The silence thick with unspoken defenses. Clara, unable to bear the tension, stood abruptly, her voice breaking. This is unbearable. Mr. Grayson was like family to me. He knew something, didn't he? Something someone wanted to keep hidden. Her outburst drew every eye, and Travers moved to her side, his expression torn. Clara, don't, he said, his voice low. You'll only make things worse. But Clara shook him off, her eyes blazing. Worse? How could it be worse? Someone killed him, Lionel, and we're all pretending it's just a puzzle to solve. Miss Marple watched the exchange closely, noting the raw emotion in Clara's voice and the protective, almost desperate edge in Travers's response. She also observed Gerald's subtle shift, his barrister's calm giving way to a flicker of unease, and Mrs. Hartley's sudden stillness, as if she were holding her breath. The room was a tinderbox, and Violet's confession had struck a spark, revealing not only her secret but the fragility of the others' facades, seeking to ease the tension. Miss Marple addressed the group, her voice calm but commanding attention. My friends, she said, Miss Pennington has shown great courage in speaking out. It reminds us that fear often keeps the truth hidden, but it cannot do so forever. Mr. Grayson, I suspect, knew something that made him a danger to someone in this house. We must consider what that something was and why it was worth killing for. Her words shifted the mood, turning suspicion inward. Hargreaves, frustrated but intrigued, demanded Violet repeat her story, but she could add little more. The partial truth had cracked the surface, but the full picture remained elusive. Miss Marple, however, was not discouraged. Violet's confession, the scuff mark, the scratched statuette, the glove, the note, and now this whispered conversation, they were all threads, and one was beginning to pull loose. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes falling on the paper that had slipped from Violet's reticule. It was gone now, tucked back inside, but she had glimpsed a familiar handwriting. one that matched the note found in Grayson's pocket. A coincidence? She mused. No. There are no coincidences in murder. The emotional turning point had revealed more than Violet's secret. It had exposed the killer's fear, and Miss Marple knew that fear would soon betray them. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle as she reflected on the day's revelations. The truth was close. She could feel it, like a pattern emerging from a tangled skein. Tomorrow, she resolved she would set a trap, using the killer's own fears to draw them into the light. Chapter 9. The trap. Morning of August 11th, 1925, brought a fragile calm to Greystone Manor. The mist outside thinning to reveal patches of pale sunlight. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained charged, the guests moving with the wary caution of chess pieces in the endgame. The murder of Mr. Grayson had frayed nerves and exposed lies, and Miss Violet Pennington's emotional confession the previous evening had left the household on edge. Inspector Hargreaves, still clinging to his suspicions of Captain Lionel Travers and young Tommy Wentworth, was growing desperate for a breakthrough. Miss Jane Marple, however, sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles silent in her lap, her mind weaving a subtle trap to ensnare the killer. She knew the truth was close, hidden in the threads of fear and deception, and today she would apply the psychological pressure needed to unravel it. Miss Marple had spent the early hours reflecting on the clues: the scuff mark in the conservatory, the scratched statuette, the single glove, the note in Grayson's pocket, Violet's whispered conversation, and the too convenient handkerchief and letter. Each pointed to a deliberate act, not of impulse, but of calculation. Driven by a motive Grayson had uncovered, the killer, she suspected, was someone whose calm facade masked a desperate need to protect a secret. To expose them, Miss Marple would need to unsettle the entire group, forcing the guilty to betray themselves. She began by requesting a gathering in the drawing room, ostensibly to discuss the investigation's progress with Lady Beatrice's permission. The guests assembled reluctantly, their faces a gallery of tension. Clara Ashford, pale and anxious, clung to Travers's arm. Travers himself stood rigid, his eyes guarded. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, her single glove conspicuous, maintained her poised elegance. Gerald Ashford, the barrister, leaned against the mantel with calculated nonchalance. Dr. Rupert Langley fumbled with his spectacles. Mr. Harold Baxter, bleary-eyed from drink, slumped in an armchair, and Miss Violet Pennington, her reticule clutched tightly, avoided eye contact. Tommy Wentworth hovered near the door, his youthful bravado replaced by unease. Inspector Hargreaves, invited to observe, stood by the fireplace, his notebook at the ready, but his expression skeptical. Miss Marple, he said, his tone gruff, I hope this isn't another of your village fancies. We've got enough on our hands without parlor games. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. No games, Inspector, she said softly, merely a conversation to clarify certain inconsistencies. Sometimes the truth emerges when people are encouraged to speak freely. She began with a gentle observation, her voice carrying the warmth of a trusted confidant. My friends, she said, addressing the room, We are all agreed that poor Mr. Grayson's death was no accident. He was a man of loyalty and discretion. Yet he knew something dangerous enough to cost him his life. I believe that secret was discussed in the conservatory at 8:30, as Miss Pennington overheard. But what was it, and who? Was there? The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to one another. Miss Marple continued, her tone deceptively mild. Let us consider the statuette, so conveniently placed yet so curiously marked. That scratch on its base was not made in the act of killing, I think, but earlier when it was moved. And the scuff mark on the floor, a sign of a quick pivot, suggests someone struck with precision. From above, as Dr. Langley noted, these are not the marks of a panicked act but of a plan. Travers's jaw tightened, and he spoke sharply. You're suggesting someone staged it, Miss Marple. That's absurd. The statuette was there for anyone to grab. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. Indeed, Captain, but not everyone would wipe it clean of fingerprints or leave a handkerchief with your initials so neatly tucked away. Nor would everyone know to meet Grayson at precisely 8:30, as the note in his pocket suggests. Mrs. Hartley's hand froze on her glove, and she interjected, her voice smooth but strained. Are you implying I planted that letter in my room? Miss Marple, I assure you, I had no part in this. Miss Marple's eyes met hers, gentle but piercing. I imply nothing, Mrs. Hartley, but the absence of your second glove is curious, is it not? I found one in the library, embroidered just like the one you wear. Perhaps it was dropped in haste, near the conservatory. The room grew still, the accusation hanging like a drawn blade. Mrs. Hartley's composure wavered, her eyes flickering with something akin to fear. Gerald Ashford stepped forward, his voice sharp. This is speculation, Miss Marple. You've no proof of anything. Miss Marple inclined her head. Proof, Mr. Ashford, comes from patterns. And the pattern here is one of fear of what Grayson knew. Fear of exposure. Someone in this room feared him enough to kill. She turned to Dr. Langley, whose spectacles slipped as he flinched. Dr. Langley, you said the blow was struck from above. Could it have been someone shorter, standing on the gardening ladder? In the conservatory, it's a small detail, but it changes the picture, does it not? Langley stammered. I suppose it's possible, but I didn't see a ladder. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. No, you didn't. But someone did and used it. The trap was tightening, and Miss Marple pressed further, her voice calm but relentless. Let us consider motive. Grayson overheard something, a conversation, perhaps, as Mr. Baxter mentioned, or a secret he stumbled upon. He was protective of Miss Clara, was he not? Perhaps he learned something about her engagement, or about someone's past. Her eyes swept the room, lingering on Travers, then Gerald, then Mrs. Hartley, a secret worth killing for. Clara, unable to bear the tension, stood, her voice breaking. Stop it. You're tearing us apart. Grayson was kind, but he wasn't prying into anyone's life. Travers pulled her close, his face pale, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand trembled. Gerald's eyes narrowed, and Mrs. Hartley's gloved hand clenched, while Violet Pennington's reticule slipped again, revealing the edge of that familiar paper. Miss Marple seized the moment, her voice rising slightly. "Miss Pennington, that paper in your reticule, might it be related to the note in Grayson's pocket? The handwriting, I think, is similar. Would you show it to us?" Violet froze, her face ashen, and the room held its breath. Slowly, she reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded note, her hands shaking. It's just a letter," she whispered, but as she handed it to Miss Marple, the truth was clear. The handwriting matched the note found on Grayson, and it bore a single word: "Sorry." The room erupted in gasps, and Hargreaves lunged forward, snatching the note. "What's this, then? Another clue you've been hiding?" Violet's tears spilled over, and she shook her head. "I didn't mean to hide it. I found it in my room yesterday, slipped under the door. I thought it was a mistake." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was racing. The note was not an apology, but a taunt, another thread in the killer's web, designed to shift blame. As Hargreaves barked questions at Violet, Miss Marple observed the guests' reactions: Travers's clenched fists, Gerald's calculated stillness, Mrs. Hartley's sudden pallor, Langley's nervous fidgeting, Baxter's drunken confusion. The trap had worked not in forcing a confession, but in revealing fear. The killer, she knew, was watching, their composure cracking under the weight of her words. "The truth is near," she murmured to herself, "and it will not stay hidden much longer." As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple retired to her room, her trap set, and the stage prepared for the final revelation. The killer's fear had betrayed them, and tomorrow she would pull the final thread to unravel the mystery of Greystone Manor. Chapter 10. The reveal evening of August 11th, 1925. Descended upon Greystone Manor with a stillness that belied the storm about to break. The drawing-room, bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, was a stage set for revelation, its heavy drapes and polished furniture a stark contrast to the raw tension among the guests. Miss Jane Marple had spent the day weaving her trap, using subtle pressure to expose the fears and lies that cloaked the murder of Mr. Grayson, the butler. Now, as the guests gathered at her request, their faces a mosaic of dread and anticipation, she prepared to unravel the mystery with a precision that would leave no thread untied. Inspector Hargreaves stood by the fireplace, his notebook worn, but open, his skepticism tempered by a grudging respect for Miss Marple's persistence. Lady Beatrice, regal in her black dress, presided over the assembly, her eyes sharp with expectation. Clara Ashford clung to Captain Lionel Travers's arm, her face pale. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley sat poised but tense, her single glove conspicuous. Gerald Ashford leaned against the mantel, his barrister's calm strained. Dr. Rupert Langley fidgeted with his spectacles. Mr. Harold Baxter nursed a whiskey, his joviality gone. Miss Violet Pennington clutched her reticule, her confession still raw, and young Tommy Wentworth hovered near the door, his eyes wide. Miss Marple rose from her armchair, her knitting basket set aside, her voice calm but commanding. "My friends," she began, We have gathered to uncover the truth about Mr. Grayson's death. It was no random act, but a calculated murder. Driven by a secret, he uncovered a secret someone in this room was desperate to keep hidden. Let us retrace the steps that led to this tragedy. She paced slowly, her eyes sweeping the group. On the evening of August 8th, Mr. Grayson was struck down in the conservatory with a bronze statuette. A blow delivered with precision from above. As Dr. Langley confirmed, the statuette bore a scratch on its base, not from the killing, but from being moved earlier, perhaps to stage the scene. A scuff mark on the floor suggested a quick pivot, a sign of intent. And a note in Grayson's pocket, "Meet me at 8:30, indicated. He was lured to his death. Hargreaves grunted, but Miss Marple continued, undeterred. The police found a handkerchief with Captain Travers's initials and a letter in Mrs. Hartley's room, both pointing to guilt. Yet these were too convenient, too neatly placed. They were red herrings, meant to mislead. But other clues, the glove in the library, matching Mrs. Hartley's, the shadow Tommy saw, Violet's overheard conversation told a truer story. She turned to Violet, her tone gentle. "Miss Pennington, you heard Grayson speaking to a man at 8:30, in whispers, and he seemed frightened. You found a note in your room, saying sorry, in handwriting matching the one in Grayson's pocket. This was no apology, but a taunt, meant to frighten you into silence." Violet nodded, tears brimming, and Miss Marple's gaze softened before sharpening again. "Let us consider motive," she said. "Grayson was protective of Miss Clara, and he was distracted in the days before his death. Mr. Baxter mentioned an argument by the stables, and Captain Travers admitted Grayson questioned him about rumors from the war. But what did Grayson know? A secret about the engagement, perhaps, or a past that threatened someone's future?" Clara gasped, her hand tightening on Travers's arm. But Miss Marple's eyes moved to Mrs. Hartley. "Mrs. Hartley, your glove in the library is curious. You claimed the letter was planted, yet you were near the conservatory at 8:30, in the powder room. The walls are thin. Did you overhear something?" Mrs. Hartley's face paled, her voice sharp. "I heard nothing. Miss Marple, you're grasping at straws." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but relentless. "Not straws, Mrs. Hartley, but threads. Let us turn to the statuette. Its scratch suggests it was moved, perhaps placed on the gardening ladder to allow a shorter person to strike from above. Dr. Langley, you confirmed the blow's angle, yet you seemed nervous when I mentioned the ladder. Why?" Langley's spectacles slipped, his voice faltering. I didn't see a ladder. I told you that." Miss Marple nodded, then turned to Gerald. "Mr. Ashford, you were in the library, close to the conservatory. You claim you heard nothing, yet your unease suggests otherwise. Did Grayson know something about your financial matter, perhaps, or a family secret?" Gerald's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent, his fingers twitching. Finally, she addressed Travers. "Captain Travers, you spoke to Grayson about rumors. Were they about your past, or something closer to home? Your protectiveness of Clara is admirable, but it hides a fear, does it not?" Travers's face darkened, but before he could speak, Mrs. Hartley stood, her voice trembling with fury. "Enough," she cried. "You accuse us all, yet you have no proof. I won't stand for this." Her outburst drew every eye, and Miss Marple seized the moment, her voice cutting through the tension. "Proof, Mrs. Hartley, lies in the pattern Grayson overheard. A conversation, one that threatened your carefully guarded past. You were once involved with a man whose ruin was tied to Captain Travers's war record. Were you not? Grayson learned of it, perhaps through a letter you thought destroyed, and he intended to protect Clara by exposing you." Mrs. Hartley's face drained of color, her glove falling to the floor. "That's absurd," she whispered, but her voice cracked. Miss Marple pressed on. "You lured Grayson to the conservatory with the note, using the ladder to strike him with the statuette. You wiped it clean, but the scratch and scuff mark betrayed you. The handkerchief was planted to frame Travers, and the letter in your room was a mistake, your own handwriting, meant to mislead, but left in haste." The room was silent, every breath held. Mrs. Hartley swayed, then sank into her chair, her eyes wide with defeat. I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "He knew about my past, about the scandal. He was going to tell Clara, ruin everything. I only meant to scare him, but he turned, and I panicked." Hargreaves, stunned, moved to her side, his cuffs at the ready. "Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, you're under arrest for the murder of Mr. Grayson," Clara sobbed, and Travers held her close, his own relief palpable. The other guests stared, some in shock, others in quiet vindication. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her expression serene. "The truth, my friends, is like a skein of wool. It may tangle, but with patience it can be unraveled." As Hargreaves led Mrs. Hartley away, the room exhaled. The weight of the mystery lifted at last. Chapter 11. The Reflection Fay morning of August 12, 1925, dawned clear over Greystone Manor, the golden sunlight filtering through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the polished floors. The oppressive weight that had clung to the house since Mr. Grayson's murder had lifted, replaced by a quiet relief tempered with melancholy. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's confession the previous evening had unraveled the mystery, revealing her as the killer who struck down the butler to protect a scandalous secret from her past. The guests, though shaken, were beginning to reclaim a semblance of normalcy. But the echoes of the tragedy lingered, and Miss Jane Marple, ever the observer of human nature, prepared to take her leave with a final reflection on the case. In the drawing room, where the air was lighter but still tinged with solemnity, Miss Marple sat with her knitting basket, her needles moving with their familiar rhythm. Lady Beatrice, her authority restored but softened by the ordeal, had insisted on hosting a farewell tea for Miss Marple, acknowledging her role in solving the crime. The guests, save for Mrs. Hartley, who was now in police custody, gathered one last time, their faces a mixture of gratitude and weariness. Clara Ashford, her eyes red but hopeful, sat beside Captain Lionel Travers, whose protective demeanor had softened into quiet relief. Gerald Ashford, Dr. Rupert Langley, Mr. Harold Baxter, Miss Violet Pennington, and young Tommy Wentworth completed the circle, each bearing the marks of the past day's strain. Inspector Hargreaves, though still gruff, had grudgingly admitted Miss Marple's brilliance, his notebook now filled with the details of Mrs. Hartley's confession. He stood by the door, overseeing the proceedings with a watchful eye, but his earlier skepticism had given way to a reluctant respect. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice less brusque than before, "I'll admit, I didn't think much of your methods at first, but you've a sharp mind, madam, sharp as a tack." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with her characteristic modesty. "You are too kind, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I merely observe, you see, and people are so very revealing if one knows how to look. A village like St. Mary Mead teaches one much about human nature, its kindness, its frailties, and, sadly, its capacity for deceit." Lady Beatrice, seated at the head of the room, inclined her head. "Miss Marple, you have done Greystone Manor a great service. I confess, I doubted anyone could untangle this dreadful affair, but your insight has restored order to my home." Her words, though formal, carried a warmth that spoke of genuine gratitude. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her gaze sweeping the group. "Order is a fragile thing, Lady Beatrice," she said. "It is built on trust, and trust, once broken, is hard to mend." Mr. Grayson's death was a tragedy born of fear of a past that Mrs. Hartley could not escape. She believed silence could protect her, but secrets, like threads, have a way of coming loose. Clara, her voice trembling, spoke up. "Miss Marple, how did you know it was her? There were so many clues, so many lies. I thought it might be anyone." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes kind but piercing. "My dear, it was the small things, the glove in the library, matching hers, the scratch on the statuette, made when she moved it to the ladder, the scuff mark from her pivot as she struck. These were not planned, you see, but accidents, moments of truth she could not erase, and her agitation when I mentioned the glove. Her haste to deny the letter betrayed her." Travers, his arm around Clara, nodded slowly. "I thought it might be me they'd pin it on. With that handkerchief, I should have known it was to Neat." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, Captain, the handkerchief and the letter were meant to mislead, to point fingers at you or others. But the truth lies in what cannot be staged, the human heart, its motives, its mistakes." Gerald Ashford, his barrister's composure restored, raised a glass of brandy. "To your little grey cells, Miss Marple," he said, a wry smile playing on his lips. "You've outdone us all." The others murmured agreement, though Dr. Langley's smile was strained, and Baxter's was tinged with relief. Violet Pennington, her reticule now less tightly clutched, whispered, "I'm glad it's over. I couldn't have borne another day of it." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Violet, her mind recalling the note. Sorry, that had nearly broken the spinster's resolve. "Miss Pennington," she said softly, "you showed great courage in speaking out. It is not easy to face one's fears, but you did so, and that helped light the way." Violet's eyes glistened, and she nodded, a small smile breaking through her usual reserve. As the tea concluded, Miss Marple rose, her small figure commanding a quiet authority. "I shall return to St. Mary Mead this afternoon," she said. "But I leave you with a thought. We are all capable of error, of fear, of hiding what we cannot face. Yet it is in facing those truths that we find peace." Mr. Grayson's death was a reminder that secrets, however deeply buried, will surface, and justice, however slow, will follow. The guests fell silent, her words settling over them like a benediction. Lady Beatrice escorted her to the door, where a taxi waited to carry her back to the village. "You will always be welcome at Greystone, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "You are most kind, Lady Beatrice, but I hope my next visit will be for a happier occasion, perhaps a wedding." She glanced at Clara and Travers, who blushed but smiled as the taxi pulled away. Miss Marple gazed out at the rolling hills of Devonshire, her mind already turning to the quiet routines of St. Mary Mead. The case of Greystone Manor had been a puzzle, but one solved through patience and observation, qualities she valued above all. "People are so very like my knitting," she murmured to herself. "A tangle at first, but with care, the pattern always emerges." Back at the manor, the guests dispersed, their lives forever marked by the tragedy and its resolution. The sun climbed higher, bathing Greystone in light, and the house, though scarred, stood ready to heal. Miss Marple, her work done, faded into the village's embrace, her unassuming presence a quiet promise that no secret could hide from her little grey cells. Chapter 12. The quiet departure at the afternoon of August 12, 1925, bathed Greystone Manor in a serene glow. The sunlight filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the drive, casting dappled patterns on the gravel. The resolution of Mr. Grayson's murder had lifted the oppressive cloud that had hung over the estate. But a quiet melancholy lingered, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the cost of secrets. Miss Jane Marple, having unravelled the mystery with her unerring insight, prepared to depart, her work at Greystone complete. Yet, as was her custom, she left behind not only a solved case, but a gentle nudge toward understanding the human heart. The drawing room, where the guests had gathered for Miss Marple's farewell tea the previous day, was now empty, save for Clara Ashford and Captain Lionel Travers, who stood by the window, their hands entwined. Clara's face, though still pale, held a spark of hope, and Travers's military bearing had softened, his eyes warm as they met hers. The other guests, Gerald Ashford, Dr. Rupert Langley, Mr. Harold Baxter, and Miss Violet Pennington, had retreated to their rooms or the gardens, seeking solace in solitude or the promise of a new day. Lady Beatrice, ever the formidable hostess, had overseen the house's return to order. Her sharp commands to the servants a sign of her determination to move forward. Miss Marple, her wicker basket tucked under her arm, stood in the grand hall, adjusting her sensible hat as she waited for the village taxi. Lady Beatrice joined her, her black dress rustling with authority, though her expression was softer than usual. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low but sincere, "you have done more than solve a crime. You have restored peace to my home, and for that I am deeply grateful. Greystone Manor will not forget you. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled with her characteristic modesty. You are too kind, Lady Beatrice, she replied. I merely followed the threads. You see, as one does with a tangled skein of wool. People are not so different they leave patterns. If one knows where to look. She paused, her gaze drifting to the conservatory, now cleansed of its grim associations. Mr. Grayson was a good man, loyal to this house. His loss is felt, but his truth has been honored. Lady Beatrice nodded, her lips tightening briefly. He was loyal, indeed, too loyal, perhaps, for his own good. Her words carried a weight of regret, and Miss Marple, ever perceptive, understood the unspoken guilt of a mistress who had not seen the danger lurking in her own home. Clara and Travers approached, their faces bright with tentative hope. Miss Marple, Clara said, her voice steady despite the faint tremor in her hands. I don't know how to thank you. You saved Lionel from suspicion, and you gave us back our future. Travers nodded, his voice gruff but earnest. I was a fool to keep quiet about Grayson's questions. I thought it would protect Clara, but it only muddied the waters. You saw through it all. Miss Marple's smile was warm, her eyes kind but sharp. My dear Captain, secrets are heavy burdens, and they rarely protect as we hope. You and Clara have a bright path ahead, I think, if you trust one another. She turned to Clara, her tone gentle. And you, my dear, must remember that love thrives on truth, not shadows. Mr. Grayson would have wanted that for you. Clara's eyes glistened, and she nodded, clutching Travers's hand. We'll be married soon, she said softly, and we'll honor Grayson's memory. Miss Marple inclined her head, satisfied, and made a mental note to send a small gift for their wedding, a pair of embroidered handkerchiefs, perhaps to replace the one that had caused such trouble. As the taxi pulled up, Miss Violet Pennington emerged from the drawing room, her reticule less tightly clutched, her face less haunted. Miss Marple, she said, her voice stronger than before, I was so afraid to speak, but you made it possible. Thank you. Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile reassuring. Courage, Miss Pennington, is often found in the smallest acts. You did well, and you will find your peace. The other guests, alerted to her departure, gathered in the hall. Gerald Ashford offered a formal bow, his barrister's reserve tempered by respect. You've taught me a thing or two about observation, Miss Marple, he said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Dr. Langley, his spectacles steady for once, murmured his thanks, while Mr. Harold Baxter, sobered by the ordeal, managed a gruff, well done, madam. Young Tommy Wentworth, lingering at the back, gave a shy wave, his relief palpable now that suspicion no longer shadowed him. Inspector Hargreaves, standing by the door, cleared his throat. Miss Marple, I'll be reporting this case to my superiors, and I'll make sure they know your part in it. You've a knack for this. I'll give you that. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. You are most generous, Inspector, but I am merely an old woman who notices things. The credit belongs to the truth, which always finds a way. With a final nod to Lady Beatrice, Miss Marple stepped into the taxi, her small figure a quiet contrast to the grandeur of Greystone Manor. As the car wound down the drive, she gazed out at the rolling hills of Devonshire, her mind already settling into the familiar rhythms of St. Mary Mead. The case had been a challenge, but not unlike the puzzles she encountered in her village jealousies, fears, and secrets, all woven into the fabric of human nature. People are so very predictable, she murmured to herself, her knitting basket resting on her lap. Yet each time, they surprise me with their capacity for both folly and redemption. She thought of Mrs. Hartley, now facing justice, her elegance undone by a desperate act, of Clara and Travers, whose love would now bloom free of shadows, and of Grayson, whose loyalty had cost him his life, but had ultimately led to the truth. As the taxi reached the village, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her cottage, her garden, and the quiet evenings by the fire. There would be other mysteries, she knew, for human nature was an endless tapestry of light and shadow. But for now, she was content to return to her knitting, her little grey cells at rest until the next pattern emerged. Greystone Manor receded into the distance, its walls standing firm against the passage of time. The guests, too, would move forward, their lives forever marked by the events of those few days, and Miss Marple, unassuming and unnoticed by the world, carried with her the quiet satisfaction of a truth well told, her departure as silent and profound as her arrival.